Hey guys, tonight we're talking about life expectancy in the Middle Ages, a time when simply waking up in the morning counted as a personal achievement. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval history had a most misunderstood statistic award, it would go, without competition, to this sentence. People in the Middle Ages only lived to about 30. This line gets repeated so often that it has basically achieved folklore status. It is quoted confidently, dramatically, and almost always incorrectly, usually by someone who has never stopped to ask what an average actually is. Because this number does not mean medieval adults woke up on their 30th birthday, looked in the mirror, and said, "Ah yes, the time has come," before gently collapsing into the nearest ditch. What it actually means is that childhood was an obstacle course designed by fate on a bad day. Life expectancy is an average, not a countdown timer. And medieval averages were absolutely demolished by infant and child mortality. When huge numbers of children die very young, and in the Middle Ages they did, the math becomes deeply unhelpful. The average sinks, even if the adults who survive go on to live fairly long, stubborn lives. Imagine a village where half the children never reach adulthood. The survivors might live into their 50s or 60s, long enough to complain about their joints, criticize the youth, and insist things were better back in my day. But the average still looks grim, because the early deaths pull the number down like an anchor tied to a sinking boat. This is why medieval life expectancy looks horrifying on paper. Birth itself was risky. Infancy was dangerous. Childhood was a long series of chances to get unlucky. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no germ theory, and no one saying, "Maybe don't drink that." A fever was not a minor inconvenience. It was a negotiation. A small cut was not an annoyance. It was a potential career-ending injury for your entire life. The medieval world was not filled with weak adults. It was filled with adults who had already survived the hardest part. Those who made it past childhood were not fragile. They were battle-tested. So that famous number does tell us something important. Just not what people think. It tells us the Middle Ages were not a world of short lives. They were a world where survival was front-loaded, uneven, and deeply unfair. Which, frankly, is a very medieval way to do statistics. If medieval life expectancy was a numbers problem, birth was where the math immediately tried to kill you. Being born in the Middle Ages was not a gentle entrance into the world. It was a high-risk event involving pain, uncertainty, and a complete lack of anyone who actually knew what they were doing. Childbirth was dangerous for everyone involved. Mothers faced labour without anaesthesia, without antiseptics, and without the comforting presence of someone who understood infections. Midwives relied on experience, prayer, and a collection of herbal remedies that ranged from helpful to, "This might make things worse, but we are committed now." There were no hospitals in the modern sense. No emergency surgery, no sterile instruments. If complications arose, the solution was often spiritual encouragement and hoping the situation respected good intentions. And the baby? The baby entered a world that immediately tested its commitment to staying alive. Exposure to cold, poor nutrition, and disease began almost instantly. Even the first few days were critical. Many infants did not survive long enough to be formally named, not because parents did not care, but because naming someone who might not survive the week was emotionally expensive. Birth records from the Middle Ages reflect this harsh reality. Baptisms were sometimes rushed, not out of panic, out of experience. People knew the odds. They lived with them. Mothers who survived childbirth were not automatically safe either. Infection, hemorrhage, and complications could end lives days later, long after the baby had arrived and everyone thought the danger had passed. Survival required luck layered on top of resilience. What makes this especially grim is repetition. Women did not face this risk once. They faced it again and again. Multiple pregnancies were common. Each one was another roll of the dice, another conversation with fate that no one asked to have. And yet, people kept having children, not because they were careless, but because survival depended on it. High mortality required high birth rates. Families adapted, even when adaptation meant living with constant uncertainty. Medieval people did not assume birth meant life. They hoped for it. Carefully, quietly, and with the emotional restraint of people who had learned that optimism needed limits. Birth in the Middle Ages was not the beginning of safety. It was the beginning of a long negotiation. If you survived birth in the Middle Ages, congratulations. You had officially cleared the tutorial. Unfortunately, the real game started immediately afterward, and it was significantly harder. Childhood was not a protected, innocent phase of life. It was the most statistically dangerous period you would ever experience, and it showed absolutely no mercy. Medieval children faced dangers everywhere. Disease was constant. Hygiene existed, but without any understanding of why it mattered. Germs were invisible, mysterious, and apparently very committed to their work. A simple fever could spiral into something fatal, and no one knew when it crossed that line. Doctors did not measure symptoms. They guessed confidently. Accidents were another favourite threat. Children worked early. They played near animals, tools, open fires, rivers, wells, and carts with no safety standards whatsoever. Falling into something was not a rare mishap. It was a common childhood milestone. And without modern medical care, injuries that seem minor today could quietly end a life. Nutrition didn't help. Many children lived on diets heavy in grains and light in variety. In good years, this was manageable. In bad years, it weakened bodies and lowered resistance to illness. Hunger made everything worse, including survival. Parents knew this. They watched children grow with a mixture of love and restraint. Every milestone was celebrated quietly, cautiously, as if joy itself might attract bad luck. The longer a child lived, the better their chances became, but no one ever fully relaxed. This is where modern misunderstandings begin. We imagine medieval childhood as emotionally cold. It was not. It was emotionally careful. Loving deeply while expecting loss was a survival strategy. People learned to hope in measured doses, and yet, despite everything, many children did survive. Those who made it past the most dangerous early years grew stronger, tougher, and remarkably resilient. By adolescence, survival odds improved significantly. At that point, you had beaten the hardest level without even realizing it. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not short because people didn't value children. It was short because the world did not care. If you reached adulthood, you didn't just grow up. You earned it. There is a stubborn myth that medieval parents didn't love their children because so many of them died. The logic usually goes like this. If loss was common, attachment must have been weak. This idea sounds neat, emotionally tidy, and completely wrong. Medieval parents loved their children intensely. We know this from letters, wills, prayers, church records, and graves. Parents mourned deeply. They grieved publicly and privately. They wrote about their children. They paid for memorials when they could afford them. They did not shrug and move on like emotionally distant robots made of straw and theology. What medieval parents practiced was not emotional detachment, it was emotional management. When death is common, you do not stop loving. You stop assuming. You learn to love while holding back just enough to survive the grief if the worst happens. This wasn't coldness. It was experience. Parents celebrated milestones carefully. A child's first year mattered. Reaching early childhood mattered. Surviving winter mattered. Each stage unlocked a little more relief, a little more hope. Naming ceremonies were sometimes delayed, not because parents were indifferent, but because naming someone who might not survive the month was emotionally expensive. It was grief budgeting. You can see this caution everywhere. Parents prayed obsessively. They used charms. They followed folk remedies. They tried everything available, even when those options ranged from mildly helpful to deeply questionable. This wasn't ignorance. It was desperation mixed with love. And when children died, parents did not respond with stoicism. They responded with mourning that looks painfully familiar to us. Tears, prayers, guilt, anger, and silence appear repeatedly in medieval records. Loss hurt then just as much as it hurts now. The difference was frequency, not feeling. Ironically, this myth exists because medieval parents adapted so well. They functioned despite loss. They continued working, raising families, and living. Modern observers mistake resilience for indifference. But resilience is not the absence of love. It is what love looks like when it has no choice but to continue. Medieval parents loved their children fully, just without the luxury of assuming a happy ending. Here's the plot twist most people never hear. If you survived childhood in the Middle Ages, your life expectancy quietly improved. Dramatically. Not magically. This was still the Middle Ages, but enough to completely reframe that infamous "people only live to 30" line. Once you made it past infancy, early childhood, and adolescence, you had already cleared the most dangerous phase of medieval life. At that point, you were no longer constantly rolling the dice against nature. You were still playing the game, but the odds had stopped being openly hostile. Many medieval adults lived into their 50s. Quite a few reached their 60s. Some even reached their 70s, at which point the village collectively decided you were either blessed, cursed, or secretly immortal. Old age wasn't common, but it absolutely existed, and when it did, it came with authority. Elders were respected, consulted, and occasionally blamed for everything that went wrong, which is still how old age works today. This is where modern misunderstandings really collapse. Medieval society was not a place where everyone died young. It was a place where many died young, and the survivors often lived surprisingly long lives. Life expectancy statistics hide that distinction, flattening complex human experiences into a single misleading number. Once adulthood was reached, people settled into rhythms. They worked, married, raised families, complained about aches, and developed strong opinions about how lazy the younger generation had become. In other words, adulthood looked familiar, just with fewer safety nets and more medieval consequences. This doesn't mean life suddenly became safe. Disease, accidents, and hardship never fully disappeared. But survival stopped being a daily surprise. If you made it to adulthood, you had proven yourself remarkably resilient, even by medieval standards. It's also worth remembering that medieval people did not expect to live forever. They didn't plan for retirement. They planned for continuity, passing knowledge, land, skills, and traditions to the next generation while they could. Surviving childhood didn't guarantee a long life, but it unlocked the possibility of one, and in a world where survival was never promised, that possibility meant everything. Surviving childhood in the Middle Ages did not mean you had beaten disease. It meant disease had agreed to stop sprinting at you, and instead walk calmly behind you for the rest of your life. Illness was not an occasional visitor. It was background noise, always present, always waiting for an opening. Medieval people lived in close quarters with animals, waste, smoke, and each other. Towns smelled the way you would expect when sanitation was more of a suggestion than a system. Clean water was not guaranteed. Food spoiled easily. And no one knew why any of this mattered, which is a crucial detail. Without germ theory, disease made no sense. Illness appeared random and deeply personal. One person survived a fever. Another did not. One family lost several members in a single season. Another emerged untouched and immediately became suspicious to everyone else. Plagues arrived suddenly and left chaos behind. Some were local, some were regional, some rewrote history. Even outside major outbreaks, smaller illnesses chipped away constantly. Respiratory infections, stomach illnesses, parasites, and skin infections were everyday realities. If you were alive, you were fighting something. Medical responses were enthusiastic but misguided. Doctors relied on ancient theories about bodily humours. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, sweating, and strongly worded optimism. Sometimes patients recovered despite the treatment. Sometimes they recovered because they stopped receiving it. Doctors called both outcomes success. What made disease especially dangerous was how quickly it escalated. A mild sickness could turn severe in days. There was no concept of monitoring symptoms over time. If you worsened fast. Families often realized someone was in serious trouble only when it was already too late. Even strong adults were vulnerable. Hard work weakened bodies. Poor nutrition lowered resistance. Cold winters and bad harvests created perfect conditions for illness to spread. Survival required luck layered on top of resilience, layered on top of exhaustion. And yet, people adapted. They learned patterns. They noticed seasons of sickness. They isolated when they could. They prayed, cleaned, rested, and hoped. Hope, it turns out, was a renewable resource. Disease did not define medieval life, but it shaped every expectation. If you lived long, it was not because illness disappeared. It was because it missed you, just enough. If disease was always lurking in the Middle Ages, medicine was always nearby, confidently doing its best. And by best, we mean operating on vibes, tradition, and an impressive amount of self-assurance. Medieval medicine was not useless, but it was deeply optimistic about how little evidence it needed. Doctors believed the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, they thought, came from imbalance. The solution, naturally, was to remove something, usually blood, often a lot of it. If you were already weak, congratulations. You were about to become a teaching moment. Bloodletting was the medieval equivalent of turning something off and on again. Headache? Bloodletting. Fever? Bloodletting. Feeling sad? Probably bloodletting. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Doctors recorded both outcomes as proof that the method was sound. Herbal remedies also played a role. Some were genuinely effective. Willow bark reduced pain. Honey helped wounds. Garlic had antimicrobial properties. Unfortunately, these useful treatments were mixed in with suggestions involving astrology, prayers, and substances that probably should not have been ingested by anyone hoping to live longer. Surgery existed, but it was brave in the way standing in front of a charging bull is brave. No anesthesia, no antiseptics, no understanding of infection. Surgeons relied on speed, strength, and the patient's ability to scream loudly enough to remain conscious. Survival rates varied. Midwives and folk healers often had better practical knowledge than formally trained physicians. They learned through experience rather than ancient texts. But even they were limited by what the era understood, which was not much. The most dangerous part of medieval medicine was confidence. Doctors believed strongly in their methods. Patients trusted them because alternatives were limited to prayer or doing nothing. Sometimes doing nothing was actually the safer option, but this was difficult to explain when a man in robes was holding a knife and looking hopeful. And yet, medieval medicine did evolve. Knowledge accumulated slowly. Mistakes were repeated less often. Observations mattered, even when explanations were wrong. Medicine did not save most medieval lives, but it shaped how people understood illness, survival, and hope. In a world without guarantees, even guesswork felt better than silence. In the Middle Ages, what you ate didn't just affect your mood or waistline. It actively negotiated with your life expectancy. Diet was one of the most powerful forces shaping survival, and it worked quietly, slowly, and with absolutely no concern for fairness. For most peasants, food was repetitive and deeply beige. Bread formed the foundation of daily calories, usually dark, coarse, and packed with whatever grains happened to survive that year. Add some porridge, occasional vegetables, maybe a bit of cheese, and congratulations. You were nutritionally sustained enough to keep working, but not enough to thrive. In good years, this diet worked. Bodies adapted, people survived. In bad years, everything unravelled. Failed harvests meant hunger. Hunger meant weakened immune systems. Weakened immune systems meant disease suddenly had an open invitation. Famine rarely killed alone. It arrived with friends. Meat existed, but not regularly for the poor. It appeared on special occasions, holidays, or when something had already died and needed to be dealt with quickly. Protein scarcity didn't immediately kill people, but it quietly shortened lives by making recovery harder and illness more dangerous. Children were especially vulnerable. Growing bodies needed nutrients they didn't always get. Malnutrition slowed development, weakened bones, and left kids less able to fight infections. Many children survived, but survival came at a cost that showed up later in life. Meanwhile, the wealthy ate better. More variety, more protein, more calories. Not necessarily healthier food by modern standards, but enough to give their bodies better odds. This didn't make nobles immortal. Disease still reached them. But it nudged the statistics in their favour. Seasonality mattered. Winter diets were worse. Fresh food disappeared. Preservation methods were limited. People ate what they had, even when it wasn't ideal. Mouldy bread, watered-down ale, and questionable leftovers were normal. Complaining didn't help. Starving faster didn't either. What makes medieval diet especially tragic is how invisible its effects were. No one collapsed dramatically from eating poorly. Instead, people grew weaker over time. They healed more slowly. They survived fewer illnesses. Their lives shortened not with a bang, but with a gradual loss of resilience. Diet didn't decide who lived or died on a single day. It decided who had a fighting chance when something went wrong. And in the Middle Ages, something was always going wrong. If disease and diet didn't end your life outright in the Middle Ages, work patiently waited its turn. Medieval labour was not something you did for 8 hours and then complained about online. It was constant, physical, repetitive, and performed with the understanding that stopping was not an option unless you were actively dying. And sometimes, not even then. For peasants, work began early and ended late. Farming meant ploughing, planting, harvesting, hauling, threshing, repairing tools, fixing fences, and doing it all again next year. There were no ergonomic tools, no safety standards, and no concept of lifting with your legs. Your back was expected to figure it out on its own. Injuries were common and cumulative. A twisted ankle never fully healed. A damaged shoulder became permanent. A bad fall might not kill you immediately, but it would quietly reduce everything you could do afterward. And when your body failed, your ability to survive went with it. Work didn't usually kill people dramatically. It killed them slowly, through exhaustion, vulnerability, and wear. A weakened body was less resistant to illness. A tired person healed poorly. An injured worker became dependent, and dependency was dangerous in a world without social safety nets. Children worked early too, not because medieval parents were cruel, but because survival required it. By the time someone reached adulthood, their body had already logged decades of strain. This meant that even those who lived into older age often did so with chronic pain, reduced mobility, and a deep familiarity with suffering. Craftsmen and tradespeople fared slightly better. Their work was still hard, but less punishing than full-time agricultural labour. This difference shows up in records. Some professions lived longer on average, not because they were safer, but because they were less destructive over time. The irony is that hard work was valued culturally. Labour was moral. Idleness was suspicious. People took pride in endurance, even when endurance shortened their lives. Complaining was allowed, but quitting was not. Work didn't usually end life on a single day. It reshaped bodies year by year until something else finished the job. And if you made it to old age, every ache was a record of survival, written directly into your bones. Medieval life expectancy was already unfair, but for women the difficulty setting was quietly turned up without anyone asking for consent. Women faced nearly all the same dangers as men: disease, hunger, hard labour, and accidents. and then added one more recurring threat that never took a day off: childbirth. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages was not treated as a medical condition. It was treated as an inevitable life event that everyone hoped would go well. There were no ultrasounds, no emergency interventions, and no clear understanding of why things went wrong when they did. Complications were common. Outcomes were unpredictable. Optimism was mandatory. Childbirth itself was dangerous. Labour could last days. Bleeding, infection, and trauma were constant risks. If something went wrong, help was limited to midwives doing their best with experience, prayers, and whatever tools they had. Sometimes that was enough. Often, it wasn't. And the danger didn't end once the baby arrived. Post-birth infections quietly claimed lives days or weeks later. Women who seemed fine suddenly weren't. Families celebrated a successful birth, only to find themselves planning a funeral shortly afterward. Medieval joy had a short memory window. What made this especially cruel was repetition. Women did not face this risk once. They faced it repeatedly. Multiple pregnancies were common because survival depended on numbers. High child mortality required high birth rates. Each pregnancy was another roll of the dice with the same body, already weakened by labour, malnutrition, and work. Despite this, many women lived long lives. Records show women reaching older age, managing households, working fields, raising children, and becoming central figures in family and community life. Survival didn't mean ease. It meant endurance layered on top of responsibility. Men often died from violence or labour-related strain. Women often died from biology, doing what biology does with absolutely no concern for fairness. Life expectancy numbers reflect this imbalance, even if the stories behind them rarely get told. Being a woman in the Middle Ages did not guarantee a shorter life, but it guaranteed more risk. And every year survived was not just luck. It was quiet resilience in a world that demanded it constantly. Even when disease was quiet and food was available, medieval life carried one more persistent background threat: violence. Not constant battlefield chaos, but the kind of everyday instability that hovered just close enough to matter. War, raids, feuds, and lawlessness didn't dominate every moment of life, but they were always within reach, like a storm cloud everyone pretended not to notice. Most medieval people were not soldiers, but they lived in a world where conflicts flared often and resolved slowly. Armies moved through countryside, not around it. When they did, peasants paid the price. Crops were trampled, livestock disappeared, villages were looted strategically. Survival during wartime had less to do with bravery and more to do with not being noticed. Young men faced the highest risk. They were the ones conscripted, pressed into service, or caught in fighting whether they wanted to be or not. This skewed life expectancy even further. Entire age groups could be thinned out by a single campaign, leaving behind gaps that statistics quietly absorbed. Violence also existed at the local level. Disputes over land, inheritance, or honour could turn deadly. Law enforcement was inconsistent. Justice depended heavily on who you were, where you lived, and whether someone important cared enough to intervene. For many, avoiding conflict was a survival skill on par with farming. Accidents and interpersonal violence blended easily. Taverns, tools, animals, and weapons lived in close proximity. A bad argument combined with alcohol and sharp objects could end a life quickly. These deaths were not constant, but they were common enough to matter. What made violence especially dangerous was how it stacked with everything else. Hunger weakened bodies. Disease reduced recovery. Injury that might be survivable today could be fatal then. A wound was not just trauma. It was an invitation for infection to finish the job. And yet, medieval life was not a non-stop bloodbath. Most people lived ordinary lives most of the time. They worked, celebrated, argued, reconciled, and endured. Violence shaped expectations, not daily routines. Life expectancy suffered not because violence was everywhere, but because when it appeared, it was unforgiving. In the Middle Ages, peace was never permanent. It was something you enjoyed carefully, while it lasted. In the Middle Ages, life expectancy didn't just depend on luck, resilience, or avoiding suspicious fevers. It also depended heavily on something you had absolutely no control over: who you were born to. Social class quietly tilted the odds long before anyone had a chance to make good decisions. Peasants lived closer to danger. Hard labour, poor nutrition, exposure to the elements, and crowded living conditions all worked together to shorten lives. If you were poor, your body absorbed the cost of survival every single day. You did not get breaks. You did not get lighter duties when injured. You worked until you could not, and then you worked some more. Nobles lived differently. They ate better. They slept in warmer homes. They worked less physically demanding jobs. They had servants to absorb risk on their behalf. This mattered. Not because nobles were smarter or stronger, but because their bodies were not constantly being worn down by survival itself. This does not mean nobles were safe. Far from it. Disease did not respect titles. Plagues happily swept through castles. Poor medical knowledge affected everyone equally, and nobles had a habit of dying in wars, tournaments, and ambitious political schemes. Privilege improved odds, not outcomes. The clergy often lived longer than both peasants and nobles. Their lives involved less physical labour, more stable food access, and communal support. Monasteries functioned as early social safety nets. Regular meals, shelter, and care during illness made a measurable difference. It turns out rest and routine are good for survival. Urban life sat somewhere in between. Cities offered opportunity and danger in equal measure. Better access to food and trade competed with overcrowding, waste, and disease. Living in a city could extend your life or shorten it dramatically, depending on timing and luck. Class didn't guarantee survival. It nudged probabilities. A peasant could live long, a noble could die young. But statistically, comfort mattered. Reduced physical strain mattered. Consistent nutrition mattered. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was not evenly shared. It was distributed according to burden. And the heaviest burdens were carried by those least able to avoid them. One of the strangest modern misconceptions about the Middle Ages is the idea that old people simply did not exist. As if medieval villages were populated entirely by the young, the exhausted, and the recently deceased. In reality, old age absolutely existed. It just didn't distribute itself evenly or politely. If you walked through a medieval village, you would often find elders. Men and women with bent backs, weathered faces, and joints that complained louder than the church bells. These people had survived disease, hunger, war, childbirth, and decades of physical labour. They were not anomalies. They were survivors. What made old age rare was not biology. It was access. Access to food. Access to stability. Access to a body that hadn't been completely destroyed by work or repeated illness. Those who reached old age often did so because they had either been unusually lucky or lived lives that allowed their bodies to endure. Old age came with status. Elders were respected, consulted, and occasionally blamed for everything from bad harvests to improper youth behaviour. They were living memory. They remembered past famines, past wars, and past mistakes, which meant they were either valued for wisdom or ignored for being inconveniently correct. That said, old age was not gentle. There was no retirement, no pensions, no medical support designed to keep you comfortable. Aging meant pain. It meant reduced mobility. It meant dependence on family and community. If that support failed, survival became uncertain very quickly. Interestingly, medieval people did not view old age the way we do. It was not something everyone expected to reach. It was seen as a bonus stage, a blessing. Sometimes even a burden. Living long meant you had outlasted many of your peers, which brought both honour and loneliness. Records show people living into their 60s and 70s, sometimes even beyond. These individuals did not invalidate low life expectancy numbers. They explained them. They showed what was possible when early risks were survived. Old age in the Middle Ages was not rare because people couldn't live long. It was rare because too many never got the chance, and those who did They carried an entire era on their backs, literally and historically. By this point, it should be clear that medieval life expectancy has been doing a very poor job of explaining medieval lives. The number exists, it is technically accurate, and it is almost always misunderstood in the most confident way possible. Life expectancy is not a promise. It is not a prediction. It is not a countdown clock hovering over your head. It is an average, a mathematical summary of wildly uneven experiences. And in the Middle Ages, those experiences were uneven to the point of absurdity. When half of all children die young, averages collapse. They get dragged downward by tragedy, long before adulthood even has a chance to participate. The result is a number that sounds shocking, but explains very little unless you understand what shaped it. Modern readers often hear low life expectancy and imagine a society where everyone lived short, miserable lives. That image feels neat and dramatic. It is also wrong. Medieval people did not move through life expecting to die at a certain age. They expected uncertainty. They expected risk. They expected that survival was something you earned year by year, not something guaranteed by default. This difference matters. People planned their lives differently. They did not think in decades ahead. They thought in seasons, harvests, winters survived. Children grown strong enough to help. Each year lived was an accomplishment, not a stepping stone toward a fixed endpoint. Lifespan, the maximum age someone can reach, remained surprisingly stable across human history. What changed dramatically was how many people reached it. Medieval society filtered people early and harshly. Modern society filters far later. The ceiling did not move much. The floor did. Statistics hide that human truth. They compress grief, luck, endurance, and resilience into a single number and pretend it tells the whole story. It does not. It never has. Life expectancy tells us how dangerous a society is, not how fragile its people are. Medieval people were not biologically weaker. They were environmentally overwhelmed. Understanding this changes how we see the Middle Ages, not as a world of short lives, but as a world of high risk, where survival itself was an achievement worth respecting. When you step back and look at medieval life expectancy, without the misleading averages, a quieter truth begins to emerge. Medieval people were not constantly dropping dead at a fixed age, and they were not unaware of how dangerous their world was. They lived with that knowledge every day. Survival was not assumed. It was negotiated. Life in the Middle Ages was shaped less by a number and more by exposure. Exposure to disease, hunger, violence, childbirth, accidents, and exhaustion. Each of these risks shaved lives away unevenly, early, and often. Some people were taken quickly. Others endured long enough to become the quiet pillars of their communities. The difference was rarely moral, intelligent, or deserved. It was circumstantial. Medieval people did not expect long lives. They hoped for functional ones. A good year meant enough food, no serious illness, and everyone still breathing by winter's end. That was success. Planning decades into the future made little sense when next season was never guaranteed. And yet, people still loved deeply. They raised families, they passed on skills, they told stories, they complained about the weather, they argued with neighbours, they celebrated weddings and mourned losses with a familiarity that feels painfully modern. Shorter odds did not make life meaningless. If anything, they made it more immediate. The cruelty of medieval life expectancy is not that people died young. It is that death arrived unpredictably. Some lives were brief and unfair. Others were long and heavy with experience. The averages flatten those stories into something tidy and misleading. When someone did reach old age, it mattered. Elders were living proof that endurance was possible. They carried memory, perspective, and sometimes wisdom forged through loss. Their presence reminded everyone else that survival was not impossible, just uncertain. So the real lesson is not that medieval life was short. It was fragile. And in that fragility, people adapted. They worked, endured, and continued forward anyway. not because they misunderstood danger, but because living has always been an act of defiance against it. Life expectancy tells us how harsh a world is. It does not tell us how human the people living in it were. And medieval people were profoundly, stubbornly human, right to the end. Nefertari entered the world at a time when Egypt was preparing for one of its most powerful eras. Although her exact origins remain uncertain, what is clear is that she was raised far differently from most women of her age. This was not a girl trained merely to look regal in procession scenes or to sit silently behind a throne. From an early age, Nefertari received an education reserved for the elite: language, writing, religious symbolism, and court etiquette. She could read and write hieroglyphs fluently, a skill so rare that even many high officials lacked it. In a civilization where words were sacred and writing itself was seen as divine, literacy was power. Her name, Nefertari Meritmut, meaning the most beautiful of them all, beloved of the goddess Mut, carried religious and political weight. Beauty in ancient Egypt did not simply refer to physical appearance. It implied harmony, intelligence, moral balance, and divine favour. To be beautiful was to embody Ma'at, cosmic order itself. From the start, Nefertari was associated with this ideal, shaped to represent stability in a world ruled by gods and kings. Growing up within elite circles, she would have observed how power truly worked in Egypt. She saw how temples influenced politics, how alliances were sealed through marriage, and how queens could subtly shape policy without ever issuing commands. These lessons mattered. Egypt was not governed by brute force alone, but by symbolism, ritual, and careful performance. Nefertari learned how to speak when silence was expected, and how to remain silent when words could be dangerous. Religious training also played a central role in her upbringing. She became deeply familiar with the major gods and goddesses, particularly those associated with queenship, motherhood, and protection. This spiritual fluency later allowed her to step seamlessly into sacred roles normally dominated by priests and kings. She was not just present at rituals, she understood them. By the time Nefertari entered the royal household, she was already more than a potential wife. She was prepared to become a living symbol of Egypt itself, educated, composed, and aware of her value. In a court where appearances masked rivalries and ambition, Nefertari stood out not because she demanded attention, but because she commanded it naturally. Long before she became great royal wife, her life was already pointing towards something exceptional. When Nefertari married Ramses, she did not simply become a queen, she became the wife of a living god. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not viewed as a symbolic ruler or divinely favoured king. He was divine himself, the earthly embodiment of Horus and the chosen son of Ra. To stand beside such a figure required more than beauty or noble birth. It required absolute mastery of image, ritual, and restraint. Nefertari proved equal to the role almost immediately. Ramses was still young when they married, ambitious and determined to eclipse every ruler who came before him. From the very beginning of his reign, he understood the power of spectacle, and Nefertari became central to that vision. She was not hidden in the background like many royal wives. Instead, she appeared prominently in inscriptions, reliefs, and temple scenes, often depicted at the same scale as the king himself. A rare and deliberate choice. In Egyptian art, size equaled importance. Nefertari's prominence sent a clear message. This queen mattered. Their marriage was also political. Egypt was entering a period of intense international rivalry, especially with the Hittite Empire. Stability at home mattered as much as military strength abroad. Nefertari projected calm authority, reinforcing Ramses' legitimacy and presenting the royal household as harmonious and divinely sanctioned. Together, they embodied Ma'at, order, balance, and continuity, the very principles that kept the universe from collapsing into chaos. Yet this was not a passive partnership. Evidence suggests that Ramses genuinely trusted her judgment. Unlike many queens whose influence is inferred only indirectly, Nefertari's presence is explicit. She appears in religious roles typically reserved for kings, making offerings to gods, participating in sacred rituals, and acting as an intermediary between the divine and human worlds. This visibility was not accidental. It reflected her competence and the confidence placed in her. Emotionally, their bond appears unusually strong by royal standards. Ramses would later father dozens of children with multiple wives, but Nefertari remained his great royal wife, the primary queen, for many years. In inscriptions, he refers to her with language that goes beyond formula, emphasizing admiration and devotion. In a court built on hierarchy and power, Nefertari secured something rare, enduring favour. By marrying Ramses, Nefertari stepped into one of the most dangerous roles in Egypt. Surrounded by ambition, ritual and expectation, she did not vanish into the throne's shadow. Instead, she helped shape its image, and quietly, its authority. Nefertari's greatest strength did not lie in ceremony alone, but in diplomacy, a skill that elevated her far beyond the role of a traditional consort. During Ramses' reign, Egypt was deeply entangled in international politics. The Near East was a fragile chessboard of rival powers, shifting alliances and constant threats of war. Words, when used correctly, could prevent bloodshed. Nefertari knew this, and so did the king. Her most remarkable diplomatic role is revealed through surviving correspondence with the Hittite court, particularly with Puduhepa, the powerful queen of the Hittite Empire. These letters were not ceremonial greetings written by scribes and stamped with royal names. They were personal, warm, and politically precise. Nefertari addressed Puduhepa as an equal, "my sister," a term reserved only for rulers of the highest rank. This was not flattery. It was a statement of status. Through these exchanges, Nefertari acted as a stabilizing force following years of hostility between Egypt and the Hittites. After decades of conflict, including the famous Battle of Kadesh, peace was fragile. Treaties could be signed by kings, but trust was built through relationships. Nefertari helped maintain that trust. She sent gifts of gold, fine linen, and luxury goods, reinforcing Egypt's wealth while signaling goodwill. Each gesture carried meaning. Each word was carefully chosen. What makes this extraordinary is that she operated in a political space dominated almost entirely by men. While male diplomats negotiated borders and armies, Nefertari worked through softer but no less powerful channels: kinship language, religious symbolism, and mutual respect. She understood that diplomacy was not just about dominance, but perception. If peace appeared honourable, it was more likely to last. Her literacy gave her a decisive advantage. She could read foreign correspondence herself, understand nuance, and respond without relying entirely on intermediaries. This direct engagement made her an asset Ramses could trust in sensitive matters. It also made her visible beyond Egypt's borders, enhancing her reputation across the ancient world. In these letters, Nefertari is not passive, submissive, or ornamental. She is confident, articulate, and deliberate, a queen fully aware of her influence. Through diplomacy, rather than decree, she helped secure stability for an empire at its height. While armies guarded Egypt's borders, Nefertari guarded its peace, quietly, effectively, and with remarkable intelligence. In ancient Egypt, queenship was not only political, it was sacred. Nefertari's authority flowed as much from religion as from marriage, and she understood this better than most. The queen was expected to embody divine femininity on earth, acting as a living bridge between gods and mortals. Nefertari did not merely play this role, she inhabited it fully. She was closely associated with Isis, the divine wife, mother, and protector of kingship. Isis was not a passive goddess. She was a strategist, a magician, and a restorer of order. By aligning Nefertari with Isis in temple reliefs and inscriptions, the royal court was making a powerful statement. This queen was not just supportive, she was essential. Just as Isis restored Osiris and protected Horus, Nefertari symbolically protected Ramses and the future of Egypt. Nefertari frequently appeared performing religious rituals usually reserved for pharaohs. She made offerings to major deities, participated in temple ceremonies, and was shown engaging directly with the gods rather than standing behind her husband. These depictions were deliberate. Religion in Egypt was not personal belief alone, it was statecraft. A queen who could operate confidently within sacred space enhanced the legitimacy of the entire dynasty. Her role as God's wife and Lady of the Two Lands carried practical power. Temples were economic engines, controlling land, labour, and wealth. By participating in temple life, Nefertari indirectly influenced resources and religious networks across Egypt. Priests did not see her as ornamental. They saw her as divinely sanctioned. This sacred authority also shaped how she was perceived by the population. Common people might never see the queen in person, but they saw her image carved into stone, painted on walls, and invoked in prayers. Nefertari became familiar, reassuring, and powerful, a maternal presence within a vast and often intimidating empire. Importantly, religious power outlasted physical presence. Even as years passed and other wives entered Ramses's household, Nefertari's divine associations remained intact. Sacred imagery does not fade easily. By anchoring herself so deeply within Egypt's religious worldview, she ensured that her authority could not be easily replaced. Nefertari's strength, then, was not loud or aggressive. It was ritualized, symbolic, and enduring. Through religion, she transformed queenship into something timeless, not just the wife of a king, but a necessary component of cosmic order itself. As years passed, Nefertari's position at court remained extraordinary, but time was never neutral in the household of Ramses II. The king would live for decades and father many children with multiple wives, yet Nefertari's status as great royal wife carried a weight no other queen could easily replace. Her influence was not based on novelty or youth, but on trust built over years of shared rule, ritual, and responsibility. Royal inscriptions reveal something rare in ancient kingship: affection that appears personal rather than formulaic. Ramses spoke of Nefertari with admiration, emphasizing her wisdom and grace, not merely her beauty. This mattered. In a system where queens could be politically sidelined once they lost favour, Nefertari remained central long after the early years of the reign. Her authority did not depend on constant visibility, but on the foundation she had already secured. Motherhood strengthened this position further. Nefertari bore several of Ramses' children, including princes and princesses who played roles in court and religious life. Through them, her influence extended into the next generation. In Egypt, legacy was everything. To be remembered through one's children was to achieve a form of immortality long before death. Yet even a favoured queen could not escape the realities of time. As Nefertari aged, her appearances in official records gradually became less frequent. This was not erasure, but transition. Egypt's visual culture often emphasized idealized moments rather than chronological decline. Her image remained youthful, divine, and composed, frozen in perfection even as real life moved forward. What makes this phase of her life remarkable is the absence of rivalry or disgrace. There is no evidence of political downfall, exile, or replacement through scandal. Instead, Nefertari seems to fade gently from daily court life while retaining symbolic power. That alone suggests careful planning and deep respect. By the time her public presence diminished, her legacy was already secure. She had shaped the image of queenship under Ramses, influenced diplomacy, and anchored royal authority in religion. Younger queens might share the palace, but none carried her history. Nefertari's story during these later years is not one of loss, but of endurance. In an empire obsessed with permanence, she achieved what most never did: relevance that outlasted time, favour that survived change, and a legacy strong enough to remain untouched by silence. If Nefertari's life revealed her status, her tomb confirmed it beyond doubt. After her death, she was laid to rest in what is now considered the most spectacular burial ever created for an Egyptian queen. Tomb Q of 66 in the Valley of the Queens. Nothing about this tomb suggests modesty or routine tradition. Every wall, every colour, every figure proclaims that this woman was extraordinary. Unlike many royal tombs that emphasize power through sheer scale, Nefertari's burial space focuses on refinement, symbolism, and intimacy with the divine. The walls are covered in vivid paintings so well preserved that they appear almost modern. Deep blues, glowing reds, and luminous golds surround the queen as she journeys through the afterlife. She is shown not as a passive soul awaiting judgment, but as an active participant, speaking to gods, receiving guidance, and moving confidently toward eternity. What stands out most is how she is portrayed. Nefertari appears calm, dignified, and radiant, dressed in fine white linen, crowned with symbols of divine favour. The gods treat her as an equal, not a servant. This is a crucial detail. In Egyptian belief, how one was depicted in death reflected how one was expected to exist forever. Nefertari was not meant to vanish into the afterlife. She was meant to belong there. The religious texts illustrated on the walls, including passages from funerary books reserved almost exclusively for kings, further emphasize her elevated status. These were not decorations chosen lightly. They required approval, resources, and theological justification. Granting such texts to a queen was a declaration that her soul deserved the same protection and guidance as a pharaoh's. Even the placement of her tomb mattered. The Valley of the Queens was not merely a burial ground. It was a sacred landscape tied to rebirth and divine motherhood. By placing Nefertari there, the royal court aligned her forever with regeneration and cosmic renewal. Ironically, the tomb's perfection also underscores a mystery. Despite the grandeur, her mummy was never found there. Whether her remains were moved for protection or lost to ancient tomb robbers remains unknown. Yet perhaps that absence adds to her legend. In death, as in life, Nefertari refuses to be ordinary. Her tomb is not just a resting place, it is a statement, carved in stone and colour, that this queen was meant to be remembered forever. In death, Nefertari did not disappear into myth or abstraction. Instead, she entered a carefully constructed eternity, one designed to mirror the authority she held in life. Ancient Egyptian belief held that the afterlife was not a reward, but a continuation, a second existence that demanded preparation, knowledge, and divine approval. Nefertari was given all three. Inside her tomb, she is repeatedly shown standing before Osiris, not as a trembling soul awaiting judgment, but as a composed and confident figure. This visual language matters. Osiris was the ultimate authority over rebirth, decay, and renewal. To be depicted calmly in his presence was to signal moral perfection and spiritual readiness. Nefertari is not judged harshly. She is welcomed. She is also closely associated with Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, music, and protection of the dead. Hathor often appears guiding Nefertari, offering reassurance and safe passage. This pairing is deeply symbolic. Hathor was not only nurturing, but powerful, a deity who could destroy or protect. To walk beside her was to be under divine favour. The afterlife imagery emphasizes movement rather than stillness. Nefertari is shown walking, speaking, gesturing, and engaging. This reflects a belief that the soul remained active and conscious. Eternal life was not endless rest. It was eternal participation in cosmic order. The Queen's knowledge of sacred texts and rituals ensured that she would never be lost or confused in this journey. What is especially striking is the absence of fear. Many tombs include scenes meant to ward off dangers of the underworld, demons, traps, annihilation. In Nefertari's tomb, these threats are minimal. Her path is clear, illuminated, and protected. This visual confidence suggests that her spiritual status was considered unquestionable. This portrayal also reinforced memory among the living. Anyone who entered the tomb would see not a fragile mortal, but a victorious soul. In Egypt, remembrance sustained existence. To be remembered correctly was to live forever. Nefertari's afterlife scenes ensured that she would be remembered as composed, intelligent, and divinely accepted. Thus, her final transformation is complete. She is no longer only Queen of Egypt or wife of a king. She becomes something greater, a permanent figure within sacred cosmology. Even in death, Nefertari retains agency, dignity, and presence. Her eternity was not silent, it was deliberate. Nefertari's story does not end with her burial. In many ways, it begins there. Ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with memory, convinced that to be remembered was to continue existing. Names spoken, images preserved, stories retold. These were the tools of immortality. By that measure, Nefertari succeeded more completely than almost any royal woman of her time. Yet her legacy is marked by an unusual contradiction: overwhelming presence paired with physical absence. Her tomb survives in astonishing condition, her image vivid and alive, but her body is missing. No coffin remains, no mummy rests in the chambers prepared for her eternity. This absence has fueled centuries of speculation. Was her body moved to protect it from tomb robbers? Was it lost in antiquity? Or was it quietly reburied elsewhere, stripped of identity by time? The truth remains unknown. Paradoxically, this mystery has only strengthened her legend. Nefertari becomes more than a historical figure. She becomes an idea. Without physical remains to anchor her to mortality, she exists almost entirely through art, symbolism, and memory. Her painted face, calm and confident, has outlived stone, dynasty, and empire. For centuries after the fall of the New Kingdom, her name faded from common knowledge, buried under sand and silence. But when her tomb was rediscovered, it reignited fascination instantly. Scholars, artists, and historians recognized something rare: a woman whose power was not inferred, but declared openly on every wall. Unlike many queens known only through their husbands, Nefertari speaks for herself through imagery and inscription. Her legacy also reshaped modern understanding of women in ancient Egypt. She challenges the simplistic idea that queens were decorative or powerless. Instead, she stands as proof that intelligence, education, and diplomacy could coexist with beauty and ritual. Her life forces a re-evaluation of how authority functioned, not only through armies and decrees, but through symbols, relationships, and belief. Today, Nefertari is remembered not just as the wife of a great king, but as a figure of autonomy and refinement. Museums reproduce her images, scholars analyze her titles. Visitors stand in awe before her tomb, often describing it as intimate rather than grand, a space designed to honor a person, not just a position. In the end, Nefertari achieved what ancient Egyptians desired most. Though her body vanished, her name endured. And in Egypt, that meant she truly lived forever. Strip away the gold, the hieroglyphs, and the divine imagery, and what remains is a woman who understood power better than most kings. Nefertari's greatness was not accidental, nor was it granted to her solely through marriage. It was constructed carefully, over time, through intelligence, discipline, and an instinctive grasp of how Egypt functioned at its deepest level. She lived in a world where authority depended on balance. Too much ambition invited suspicion. Too much silence invited erasure. Nefertari walked this narrow path with precision. She did not challenge the king's supremacy, yet she expanded the meaning of queenship so thoroughly that it could never return to something lesser. After her, the idea of the queen as merely ornamental no longer held. What makes her legacy endure is not a single achievement, but coherence. Her public image, religious role, diplomatic voice, and funerary preparation all tell the same story. There is no contradiction between who she was in life and how she was represented in death. That unity is rare in any era, ancient or modern. It suggests intentional self-definition, a woman who knew exactly how she wished to be remembered and ensured that memory was secured in stone. Nefertari also benefited from timing. She lived during the height of imperial confidence, when Egypt had the resources to elevate individuals into near-mythic status. But others shared that era, and few left such a clear imprint. The difference lies in agency. Nefertari did not wait to be interpreted. She presented herself. Her story reminds us that power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it writes letters instead of laws. Sometimes it appears in ritual rather than battle. Sometimes it survives not through conquest, but through continuity. Nefertari mastered these quieter forms of influence, and in doing so, outlasted many whose names were carved deeper, but meant less. Today, she occupies a unique space between history and reverence. She is studied, admired, and still partially unknowable. That mystery is not a flaw in her legacy, it is part of its strength. Ancient Egyptians believed that the dead should retain some distance from the living, a sacred boundary that preserved their power. Nefertari remains just far enough away to command respect. In the end, she was more than the wife of a great king, more than the owner of a beautiful tomb. She was a model of how intelligence, restraint, and symbolism could shape an empire's memory. And that, perhaps, is her greatest achievement. High in the Altai Mountains, where winters harden the ground into stone and silence dominates the landscape, a group of archaeologists opened an ancient burial mound, expecting little more than broken tools and scattered bones. Instead, they uncovered something profoundly unsettling. A woman preserved by ice so perfectly that time itself seemed to have failed. She lay in a wooden chamber sealed by permafrost, her body wrapped carefully, surrounded by objects placed with intention. The cold had done what embalming could not. It halted decay completely. Her skin remained intact. Her hair still clung to her scalp. Even the delicate textures of her clothing survived. This was not a skeleton reduced to fragments. This was a person, recognizable, human, and eerily present. When the ice was removed, the shock only deepened. Dark, intricate tattoos stretched across her skin, curling into animal shapes and flowing lines. These were not decorative scratches or faded marks. They were deliberate, complex designs, placed with skill and meaning. The patterns suggested identity, belief, and status. Whoever she was, she mattered. The burial itself was extraordinary. She had been laid to rest with care, not haste. Her position, the objects around her, and the effort required to construct such a chamber in hostile terrain all pointed to importance. This was not the grave of an ordinary nomad. This was someone worth protecting from time, from animals, from forgetting. What made the discovery so haunting was not just preservation, but immediacy. Archaeologists often deal with distance, centuries reduced to artifacts. Here, that distance collapsed. The Ice Maiden confronted the modern world face to face. Her body still carried the shape of life. Her expression was calm, composed, almost deliberate. Death had not erased her presence. News of the discovery spread quickly, not because of gold or weapons, but because of her humanity. She forced a question that archaeology rarely answers so clearly. Who was she? A priestess? A leader? A healer? A warrior? The ice preserved her form, but not her story. Yet even in silence, the message was clear. This woman had lived with significance in a world long erased from written memory. The frozen earth had guarded her for more than 2 millennia. And now she was asking to be understood. To understand the Ice Maiden, one must understand the world that shaped her, the vast, mobile society of the Scythians. They were not city builders, temple raisers, or chroniclers of their own history. They left no written records to explain themselves. Instead, they lived on horseback, carried their wealth with them, and trusted memory, ritual, and movement over stone and permanence. The Scythian world stretched across immense grasslands and mountain corridors, a place defined by wind, cold, and distance. Survival here required adaptability and toughness. Communities followed seasonal routes, herding animals, trading with distant cultures, and defending themselves constantly. This was not a passive existence. It was a life shaped by motion and readiness. Within this nomadic structure, women were not confined to domestic silence. Archaeology has revealed that Scythian women rode horses, hunted, and in some cases fought. Burials show women interred with weapons, tools, and symbols of authority. The idea that power belonged only to men does not hold in this landscape. In a world where everyone depended on skill and endurance, status followed ability. Religion and belief played a central role. The Scythians viewed the natural world as alive with forces that required respect and negotiation. Mountains, animals, and the sky itself held meaning. Ritual specialists, shamans, healers, or spiritual mediators guided communities through illness, death, and transition. Tattoos, clothing, and burial practices were not decoration. They were language. This context matters deeply when viewing the Ice Maiden. Her elaborate tattoos, careful burial, and isolation from common graves suggest a role that went beyond ordinary life. In Scythian society, to invest such effort in death meant the person carried power in life, spiritual, social, or both. The Scythians also existed at a crossroads. They traded with distant civilizations, absorbing influences while retaining their identity. Persian goods, Chinese silks, and local traditions blended into something uniquely theirs. This mixture created a culture both fierce and refined, capable of artistry alongside violence. The Ice Maiden emerged from this world not as an anomaly, but as a product of it. She belonged to a society that valued strength, symbolism, and resilience. To them, preserving her body was not about mourning alone, it was about continuity, ensuring that her presence, whatever it represented, would endure beyond death. Among all the details revealed by the ice, nothing was more striking than the tattoos etched into the Ice Maiden's skin. They were not random markings or simple symbols. They were elaborate, flowing images of animals, deer with twisted antlers, mythical beasts in motion, predators locked in eternal pursuit. Even after more than 2 millennia, the ink remained dark and deliberate, as if freshly drawn. In the Scythian world, tattoos were not fashion. They were identity. These images functioned as biography written on the body itself. Each figure carried layers of meaning tied to ancestry, belief, and role within the community. Animals were not chosen casually. They represented spiritual forces, protective spirits, and personal power. To wear them permanently was to declare alignment with those forces. The placement of the tattoos matters as much as their content. They ran along her arms, shoulders, and hands, visible places, meant to be seen during daily life and ritual. This suggests her body was not hidden or restricted, but displayed intentionally. She was someone whose presence carried meaning in public space. The tattoos transformed her flesh into a living symbol. What makes this even more compelling is the level of skill involved. Tattooing in the ancient steppe was painful, dangerous, and irreversible. Infection was a real risk. Enduring such work required stamina and purpose. No one would submit to it lightly. This alone suggests status. These were not marks imposed by others. They were earned. Scholars believe the tattoos may also have served a ritual function beyond life. In Scythian belief, the soul continued after death, and identity needed to be preserved. The tattoos ensured that the Ice Maiden would be recognized in the spirit world, just as she had been among the living. Her body became a passport between realms. There is also evidence that tattoos distinguished spiritual specialists from the rest of society. Shamans and healers often bore complex markings that reflected their ability to move between worlds, the visible and the unseen. The Ice Maiden's tattoos are unusually intricate, more refined than those found on many warriors. This points toward a role rooted in knowledge rather than combat. In a culture without written records, the body itself became text. The Ice Maiden carried her story in ink and skin, readable to those who understood the language. Even now, Long after that language has faded, the message remains unmistakable. This was a woman whose identity was sacred, deliberate, and meant to endure. Her tattoos did what words could not. They survived. The Ice Maiden was not buried in ordinary clothing. Her garments were layered, deliberate, and astonishingly well preserved, offering a rare window into how identity was worn in a nomadic world. Textiles usually vanish first in archaeology, but here the permafrost acted like a vault. Wool, felt, leather, and fur survived long enough to tell a story as clearly as her tattoos. Her clothing was practical, but not plain. It was designed for movement, cold, and long journeys, yet crafted with care and visual balance. The cuts allowed for riding and walking across uneven terrain. The materials were durable, chosen for survival in harsh climates. But survival alone does not explain the precision. These garments were not thrown together. They were made to communicate. Colour mattered. Texture mattered. The layering itself mattered. In steppe cultures, clothing functioned as social language. What you wore signalled who you were, where you belonged, and how you were meant to be treated. The Ice Maiden's attire suggests elevated status, not royal in a settled sense, but respected, perhaps even revered. Some elements of her clothing show connections to the wider cultural sphere associated with the Pazyryk culture, known for its refined craftsmanship despite a nomadic lifestyle. This culture valued symmetry, animal symbolism, and skilled textile work. Clothing was not decoration alone. It was protection, identity, and ritual combined. Footwear found near her body was especially telling. Well-made boots indicate frequent travel, possibly long distances on horseback. This was not someone confined to a single camp or domestic space. She moved. She participated. She belonged to the active rhythm of nomadic life. Her headdress, though damaged, suggests ceremonial use. Headgear in steppe societies often marked spiritual roles or special occasions. Combined with her tattoos, this hints again at a woman whose function extended beyond the everyday. Clothing reinforced what ink declared. Even in burial, her garments remained intact, carefully arranged. This was not accidental. Dressing the dead was an act of belief. The Scythians prepared their dead for continuation, not disappearance. The Ice Maiden was dressed to exist beyond death as she had in life, competent, recognized, and whole. In a culture without palaces or permanent monuments, clothing became architecture of the self. The Ice Maiden's garments were her walls, her banners, her status symbols. Thanks to the ice, they survived, and through them, so did her place in the world. The Ice Maiden's burial makes one thing clear. Her authority did not come from comfort or luxury. It came from endurance. Life on the Siberian steppe was unforgiving, shaped by extreme cold, constant movement, and the demands of animals and terrain. Power in this world was not inherited easily. It was proven daily. Evidence from her remains suggests a life marked by strain and resilience. Her body shows signs of wear consistent with riding, travel, and physical labour. This was not someone sheltered from hardship. Whatever role she held, healer, ritual specialist, or leader, it required active participation in the life of her people. Respect here was earned through usefulness. Nomadic societies valued individuals who could contribute beyond the ordinary. A woman who understood herbs, illness, and ritual would have been indispensable. Illness, injury, and spiritual anxiety were constant threats. Someone who could ease pain, interpret signs, or mediate with unseen forces held real power. Such power did not rely on force, but on trust. This helps explain why the Ice Maiden was buried alone, separate from common graves. Isolation in burial was not loneliness. It was distinction. Certain individuals were set apart in death because they were set apart in life. The effort required to prepare her tomb, transport materials, and seal it in ice suggests collective agreement that she mattered deeply. Importantly, this power was not theatrical. There are no weapons beside her, no trophies of conquest. Her authority was quieter, embedded in knowledge and belief. In many steppe cultures, spiritual figures were both respected and feared. They healed, but they also commanded boundaries. Their closeness to the unseen made them necessary, and dangerous to offend. Her age at death also matters. She was not elderly, nor a child. She died in adulthood, likely while still active in her role. This raises questions. Was her death sudden? Was it connected to illness, ritual, or fate? The care taken in burial suggests reverence rather than urgency. Whatever happened, it was not dismissive. The Ice Maiden's power, then, was situational and human. She lived among her people, travelled with them, endured what they endured. That shared experience gave her legitimacy. In a society where survival depended on cooperation, such legitimacy was stronger than any title. Her life reminds us that leadership does not always sit on thrones. Sometimes it rides through snow, carries knowledge instead of weapons, and leaves its mark not in stone, but in memory and in ice. The way the Ice Maiden was buried tells us as much about her death as her life. This was not a hurried interment driven by fear or crisis. It was deliberate, ceremonial, and costly in effort. The Scythians did not stumble into preserving her. They chose it. Her burial chamber was carved into the earth and sealed in a way that allowed water to seep in and freeze. This was not accidental. In the Altai region, certain burials were intentionally designed to harness ice as protection. The community understood the land intimately. They knew that frozen ground could become a guardian stronger than stone. By sealing her within it, they placed her beyond animals, weather, and time. This suggests that her body mattered beyond mourning. In many nomadic belief systems, the physical body retained spiritual significance after death. Preserving it was a way of preserving balance. If she was a ritual specialist or healer, her body may have been seen as dangerous to disturb or powerful enough to require containment. Ice, neutral and eternal, was the safest boundary. The grave goods reinforce this idea. Objects placed with her were not excessive, but meaningful. They reflect function rather than wealth. This was not a display of status meant to impress rivals. It was preparation. She was being equipped, not celebrated. That distinction matters. There is also the question of cause. Her body shows signs of illness, possibly cancer, and injuries consistent with long-term strain. This was not a peaceful death of old age, but it was not treated as a failure either. Illness did not diminish her worth. If anything, it may have heightened her spiritual authority. In many ancient cultures, suffering was seen as proximity to the unseen. The separation of her burial from others suggests caution as much as honour. Powerful figures were often buried apart to prevent their influence from lingering too strongly among the living. This was not exile. It was respect mixed with fear. The ice did more than preserve flesh. It preserved intent. Every choice made by her community remains legible because nothing decayed. Their care, their beliefs, their priorities are frozen alongside her. Death did not erase the Ice Maiden. It transformed her role. She moved from guide of the living to presence in the landscape itself. The mountain became her marker. The cold became her shield. She was not lost to the earth. She was entrusted to it. When the Ice Maiden emerged from the frozen ground in the modern era, the shock was not limited to archaeology. Her rediscovery disrupted assumptions, scientific, cultural, and emotional, about the ancient nomadic world. This was not a distant relic reduced to fragments. This was a woman whose face, skin, and markings confronted the present almost directly. The past was no longer abstract. It was personal. For researchers, the find was unprecedented. Permafrost preservation revealed details normally erased forever. Clothing construction, tattoo techniques, health conditions, and burial intent. Entire academic debates shifted overnight. The idea that nomadic cultures were crude or lacking refinement became impossible to defend. Here was proof of medical knowledge, artistic sophistication, and complex spiritual systems, all embodied in a single individual. But the reaction did not stop at science. Among the local descendants of steppe cultures, the Ice Maiden's removal sparked controversy and grief. To them, she was not an object of study. She was an ancestor. Her disturbance was seen by some as a violation, a rupture of balance that had been carefully maintained for centuries. Illness, accidents, and misfortune were later blamed on her displacement. Whether coincidence or belief, the emotional response was real. This clash revealed a deeper tension between modern knowledge and ancient reverence. Archaeology seeks answers by uncovering. Indigenous memory seeks continuity by leaving things undisturbed. The Ice Maiden stood at the centre of this conflict, silent, preserved, and powerless to intervene in her second disruption. Museums displayed her remains behind glass, temperature controlled and labelled. Visitors stared in awe, discomfort, fascination. She became famous without consent, transformed from sacred individual to global spectacle. Yet, even in this setting, she resisted objectification. Her tattoos demanded interpretation. Her posture suggested intention. Her presence unsettled the idea that time creates distance. Eventually, pressure from local communities led to a partial resolution. Efforts were made to rebury her remains closer to her original resting place, restoring some measure of respect. The debate did not disappear, but it changed. She was no longer just a discovery. She became a reminder that the past is not neutral territory. The Ice Maiden's rediscovery forced a question archaeology rarely confronts directly. Who owns the dead? The scientists who uncover them, or the descendants who remember them? There is no simple answer. Once again, the Ice Maiden altered the world around her, not through action, but through presence. Even after 2,000 years of silence, she still had the power to disturb, to challenge, and to demand respect. The Ice Maiden did more than reveal a single life frozen in time. She forced historians to reconsider an entire world that had long been misunderstood. For centuries, nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppe were portrayed as peripheral, violent, primitive, and intellectually dependent on settled civilizations. The Ice Maiden quietly dismantled that narrative. Her body provided evidence of advanced medical awareness, artistic complexity, and symbolic thought. The tattoos alone required anatomical knowledge, steady technique, and long-term planning. Her clothing revealed mastery of textile production, adapted to extreme environments. Her burial showed deliberate engagement with landscape, climate, and belief. None of this fits the stereotype of a crude or simplistic society. Most importantly, she changed how historians viewed women in these cultures. Before her discovery, powerful women among the steppe peoples were often dismissed as exceptions or myth. The Ice Maiden proved otherwise. She demonstrated that authority, spiritual influence, and public presence were not restricted by gender in nomadic societies. Power followed function, not formality. She also blurred the line between spiritual and political leadership. In settled civilizations, those roles were often separated. Among the steppe cultures, they overlapped. A woman who understood ritual, healing, and symbolism could wield influence equal to any warrior. The Ice Maiden embodied this integration. Her life suggests leadership rooted in knowledge rather than domination. Her preservation reshaped methodology as well. Archaeologists were forced to confront how much context is lost when organic material decays. Entire aspects of ancient life, colour, texture, expression, usually vanish. The Ice Maiden reminded scholars that what survives is often only a fraction of what once existed. History, it turns out, is incomplete, not because people lacked complexity, but because evidence rarely endures. She also influenced public imagination. Unlike kings and generals, she was relatable. Her humanity was visible. Visitors did not see a conqueror. They saw a person. This emotional connection altered how audiences engaged with ancient history, making it less about abstraction and more about lived experience. In this sense, the Ice Maiden became a bridge. She connected modern observers to a vanished world, not through texts or monuments, but through presence. She made the past intimate. Her impact continues to ripple outward. Every new study of nomadic cultures now carries her shadow. Every claim of simplicity must confront her evidence. She did not speak, yet she corrected centuries of misunderstanding. History did not change because of what she said. It changed because of what she proved, simply by surviving. In the end, the Ice Maiden's greatest power lies in her refusal to disappear. Civilizations rise and fall, languages die, and entire ways of life dissolve into silence. Yet she endured, not as legend or myth, but as reality. Her survival was not symbolic. It was physical, and that makes her impossible to ignore. She represents a kind of historical honesty that written sources rarely offer. There is no court poet exaggerating her deeds, no chronicler reshaping her story to serve politics. What we see is what remained. Her body, her markings, her choices, and the care her people gave her. These are truths carved not into stone, but into flesh and ice. The Ice Maiden also challenges how we define importance. She was not an empress. She commanded no armies. Her name, if it ever had one known beyond her people, is lost. Yet her influence today rivals that of famous rulers. Why? Because she embodies lived authority, the kind that emerges from knowledge, resilience, and trust, rather than hierarchy. She forces modern audiences to confront an uncomfortable idea, that history has often remembered the loudest, not the most essential. Countless lives like hers vanished without trace simply because their worlds did not right. The Ice Maiden survived by chance, yes, but also because her people believed she mattered enough to protect forever. There is something profoundly human in that decision. They did not know she would be discovered. They did not preserve her for fame. They preserved her because they believed she should remain whole. That belief crossed centuries intact. Today, when people stand before her image or read about her life, the reaction is rarely academic alone. It is emotional. She looks back at us. She reminds us that ancient people were not abstract ancestors, but individuals with bodies, identities, fears, and purpose. The Ice Maiden does not offer comfort. She offers presence. She stands as proof that complexity does not belong only to cities, and power does not require permanence. A woman from a mobile world, without monuments, without writing, reshaped how history sees her culture simply by surviving. She was buried to be remembered by her people. She was preserved to endure. And against all odds, she succeeded. The ice let her sleep. Time failed to erase her. Stoicism did not begin as an abstract system designed in comfort. It began with failure. Its founder, Zeno of Citium, was not a noble scholar or a sheltered intellectual. He was a merchant whose life collapsed in a single moment. While transporting goods across the Mediterranean, Zeno survived a shipwreck that destroyed his cargo, his wealth, and his future, as he had imagined it. When he washed ashore in Athens, he was alive, and nearly stripped of everything that had defined him. This moment matters, because Stoicism grows directly out of that experience. Zeno did not ask how to recover his losses. He asked a deeper question. If everything external can vanish without warning, what can a person rely on? The answer he began to shape was radical for its time. Not gods, not fortune, not status, but the disciplined mind. Athens offered Zeno no sympathy. It was a city full of competing philosophies, each promising some version of happiness or truth. But most were built for those with leisure, wealth, or political influence. Zeno was an outsider, foreign-born and financially ruined. His philosophy would reflect that position. Stoicism was not about escaping the world, but enduring it. At its core, Stoicism proposed a sharp division between what is within our control and what is not. Wealth, reputation, health, and even life itself belong to the second category. Judgment, intention, and moral character belong to the first. Suffering, Zeno realized, comes not from events themselves, but from the meaning we assign to them. Lose everything, and despair follows. Unless one's sense of self was never anchored in possessions to begin with, this idea was quietly revolutionary. Greek culture prized honour, public recognition, and external success. Stoicism challenged that entire value system. It suggested that a person who loses everything can still live well, provided their inner life remains ordered. Calm was no longer a gift of good fortune. It became a skill. Zeno's shipwreck was not treated as a tragedy within Stoicism, but as proof. Proof that life is unstable. Proof that expectation breeds suffering. Proof that resilience must be internal, or it will fail when tested. Stoicism, then, was not born in theory, but in necessity. It was shaped by loss, sharpened by realism, and aimed at clarity. From the beginning, it offered something rare, a way to remain mentally unshaken in a world that offers no guarantees. Zeno did not retreat into a private school or surround himself with elite students. Instead, he chose to teach in the open air, beneath the painted columns of the Stoa Poikile, a public walkway in the heart of Athens. This choice defined Stoicism just as much as its ideas. The philosophy was not meant for a secluded few. It was meant for anyone living an exposed, unpredictable life, which meant almost everyone. The Stoa was not a quiet place. Merchants passed through, politicians argued, soldiers returned from war, slaves ran errands, Zeno taught amid noise, distraction, and disagreement. This was intentional. Stoicism was not designed to work only in silence. It was meant to be tested in real conditions, surrounded by temptation, insult, and uncertainty. By teaching in public, Zeno rejected the idea that philosophy existed apart from daily life. Stoicism was not about achieving intellectual brilliance or winning debates. It was about learning how to respond when insulted, disappointed, ignored, or harmed. The question was never "what do you know?" but "how do you act when things go wrong?" This setting also shaped Stoic ethics. Because Stoicism addressed ordinary life, it emphasized practical virtues: self-control, fairness, courage, and clear judgment. These were not abstract ideals. They were tools. A Stoic was expected to apply philosophy while running a household, serving in government, enduring poverty, or facing exile. The public nature of the Stoa also reinforced one of Stoicism's central beliefs, that human beings are social by nature. Withdrawal from society was not the goal, participation was. Stoics believed that clarity of mind made a person more useful to others, not detached from them. Emotional discipline was not coldness, it was reliability. Importantly, teaching in the Stoa stripped philosophy of prestige. Anyone could listen, anyone could challenge. Wisdom was not guarded by rank. This egalitarian aspect helped Stoicism spread far beyond Athens. It spoke to people who felt powerless in rigid social hierarchies. The Stoa itself became symbolic. Its painted walls depicted historical battles and moral scenes, reminders of chaos, ambition, and consequence. Stoicism grew beneath these images, offering a counterweight: the idea that while the world remains unstable, one's response does not have to be. By stepping into public life rather than escaping it, Stoicism made a quiet promise. You do not need ideal conditions to live well. You need discipline, clarity, and the courage to practice philosophy where life actually happens. As Stoicism developed beyond its founder, it became increasingly precise about its central concern: the inner life. Thinkers such as Cleanthes and later Chrysippus refined Stoic ideas into a disciplined system aimed at one goal: mental clarity. Not happiness in the sense of pleasure, but steadiness. A mind that does not fracture under pressure. Stoics believed that the human mind is constantly interpreting events. An insult is not painful by nature. Loss is not unbearable by default. What causes suffering is the judgment that something should not have happened. Stoicism focused on retraining this habit of judgment. The world is not obligated to align with desire. Expecting it to do so is the root of distress. This did not mean emotional numbness. Stoics felt fear, grief, and frustration like anyone else. What they rejected was being ruled by these emotions. Discipline meant noticing a feeling, understanding its cause, and choosing how to respond rather than reacting blindly. The goal was not to suppress emotion, but to prevent it from hijacking reason. Central to this was the concept of assent. Every impression that enters the mind asks for agreement. The Stoic learns to pause before granting it. Just because something appears threatening does not mean it is. Just because something feels unbearable does not mean it truly is. Mental clarity emerges in that pause. To train this skill, Stoics practiced daily mental exercises. They imagined loss in advance, not to dwell on fear, but to reduce shock when hardship arrived. They reflected each evening on their actions, not to feel guilt, but to improve judgment. Life became a kind of training ground rather than a series of surprises. This inner discipline was considered freedom. A person enslaved by impulse, craving, or panic was not free, even if wealthy or powerful. A person who could remain composed in poverty or danger possessed something stronger than external control. Stoicism redefined liberty as self-governance. Importantly, this discipline was not meant to detach a person from life. On the contrary, it made engagement possible without collapse. A Stoic could love deeply, serve loyally, and act decisively precisely because their stability did not depend on outcomes. In a chaotic world, Stoicism offered a quiet but demanding promise. Clarity is not given. It is practiced, and the battlefield is always the mind. Stoicism did not stop at personal psychology. It made a far larger claim about reality itself. The universe, Stoics argued, is not random chaos. It is governed by logos, a rational, ordered principle that shapes everything from the movement of stars to the unfolding of human lives. To live well, then, was not to fight reality, but to understand it. For Stoics, fate was not a blind force or cruel destiny. It was the natural consequence of cause and effect, stretching back endlessly. Every event had reasons behind it, even if those reasons were beyond human comprehension. Suffering came not from fate itself, but from resisting it. The famous Stoic metaphor compared life to a dog tied to a moving cart. The cart will move regardless. The dog can walk willingly, or be dragged. This worldview demanded humility. Humans were not the center of existence. They were parts of a much larger system. Expecting the universe to bend to personal desire was irrational. Mental clarity came from aligning one's will with reality as it is, not as one wishes it to be. Yet this was not fatalism in the lazy sense. Stoics did not believe effort was pointless. On the contrary, they believed human reason was itself part of the cosmic order. Acting virtuously was how one participated correctly in the universe. You could not control outcomes, but you could control intention. That distinction preserved responsibility without illusion. This idea reshaped how Stoics viewed misfortune. Illness, exile, poverty, and death were not punishments. They were natural events within a rational system. To label them bad was to confuse discomfort with moral failure. Virtue alone was truly good. Vice alone was truly harmful. Everything else was neutral material to work with. This perspective created a remarkable calm in extreme circumstances. If the universe operates according to reason, then panic is unnecessary. One's task is simply to respond well to whatever arrives. This does not eliminate pain, but it removes outrage. Reality is no longer an enemy. Importantly, Stoics did not claim to fully understand fate. They accepted mystery. The demand was not comprehension, but cooperation. Accept what cannot be changed. Act well where choice exists. Mental clarity lives in knowing the difference. This cosmic framework also supported compassion. If everyone is shaped by causes beyond their control, then cruelty makes little sense. Error comes from ignorance, not evil intent. Understanding replaces hatred. Patience replaces resentment. Stoicism's view of fate offered something rare: peace without denial. The world remains harsh. Loss still occurs. But meaning is not destroyed by hardship. It is revealed by how one meets it. To the Stoic, clarity begins when resistance ends. Stoicism might have been born in Greece, but it matured in Rome. When the philosophy crossed into the Roman world, it encountered a culture obsessed with duty, hierarchy, power, and endurance. Instead of clashing, Stoicism adapted and thrived. Its emphasis on discipline, self-control, and responsibility aligned naturally with Roman values, especially among those burdened by command. Roman Stoicism was less concerned with theory and more with application. Statesmen, generals, and administrators were not asking how the universe worked in abstract terms. They were asking how to remain steady while ruling provinces, commanding armies, or surviving political chaos. Stoicism offered an answer: control the self, and the rest becomes manageable. One of the earliest and most influential Roman Stoics was Seneca the Younger, a man who lived at the heart of imperial power while constantly warning against it. Seneca was wealthy, politically entangled, and perpetually at risk. His writings focus obsessively on time, anger, fear, and death, not as philosophical curiosities, but as daily threats. For him, Stoicism was survival training for life near the throne. Stoicism also appealed to those with no power at all. Epictetus, born enslaved, taught that freedom had nothing to do with legal status. A person could be chained and still free, provided their judgments were not enslaved by fear or desire. This idea was explosive in a society built on rigid hierarchy. It suggested that inner freedom could not be granted or revoked by authority. Perhaps the most striking example of Roman Stoicism is Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who ruled the most powerful state on earth while privately reminding himself that power meant nothing. His writings were never meant for publication. They were exercises in humility, restraint, and clarity written to himself, while surrounded by war, disease, and responsibility. In Rome, Stoicism became less a school and more a mindset. It was practiced by people who could not afford emotional collapse. It taught them how to endure success without arrogance and failure without despair. What Rome gave Stoicism was realism. What Stoicism gave Rome was restraint. Together, they produced one of history's most enduring philosophies of mental clarity under pressure. Stoicism survived because it was never meant to stay theoretical. From its earliest days, it insisted on practice, repeated, deliberate, and often uncomfortable. Philosophy, for a Stoic, was not something you admired. It was something you trained, like the body or a craft. Without practice, clarity dissolved under pressure. Stoics treated each day as a kind of exercise. Morning reflection prepared the mind for difficulty ahead. One would anticipate irritation, insult, delay, loss, not pessimistically, but realistically. By expecting friction, the Stoic reduced its power to shock. Nothing that arrived felt unfair, because nothing was unexpected. Mental clarity begins before events occur. Equally important was evening review. At the end of the day, Stoics examined their actions without self-hatred or excuse. Where did emotion override reason? Where did impatience appear? Where was restraint successful? This was not confession. It was calibration. The goal was improvement, not punishment. Another core practice was voluntary discomfort. Stoics would occasionally eat plain food, wear rough clothing, or sleep without comfort, not out of self-denial, but to weaken fear of loss. If you can tolerate little, you are not enslaved by abundance. Luxury becomes optional rather than necessary. This practice directly attacked anxiety about the future. Language itself became a tool. Stoics trained themselves to describe events accurately rather than emotionally. A betrayal became, someone acted according to their understanding, not I was wronged. Illness became, the body is impaired, not this is unbearable. By stripping away exaggerated language, the mind regained proportion. Attention to the present moment was another discipline. Stoics warned against living mentally in imagined futures or replayed pasts. Anxiety lived ahead. Regret lived behind. Clarity lived only in what could be acted upon now. This was not mystical presence, but practical focus. Importantly, Stoic practice was never solitary self-improvement for its own sake. The end goal was ethical action. A clear mind allowed fair judgment. Emotional restraint enabled patience with others. Discipline made one reliable in crisis. Stoicism was not about inner peace divorced from responsibility. It was about becoming useful. This practical orientation explains Stoicism's endurance. Empires fell, institutions changed, but the need for steadiness under pressure did not. Stoic exercises required no special tools, no retreat, no authority, only attention and effort. In this way, Stoicism functioned less like a philosophy and more like mental training. Not something to agree with, but something to live, one disciplined day at a time. Stoicism did not vanish with the decline of Rome. Instead, it quietly passed into a new intellectual world, reshaped rather than rejected. As Christianity spread across the Mediterranean, early Christian thinkers encountered Stoic ideas everywhere, in education, rhetoric, and moral language. They disagreed with Stoic theology, but found its psychological discipline impossible to ignore. Early Christian monks, especially those living in the deserts of Egypt and Syria, faced a problem Stoics had wrestled with for centuries: how to control the mind. Isolation did not bring peace. It amplified fear, anger, lust, and despair. The inner chaos was often worse than the outer world. Stoic techniques offered solutions. Figures like Evagrius Ponticus developed systems for monitoring thoughts that closely resemble Stoic psychology. He taught that disturbing thoughts arrive uninvited and must be examined before being accepted, almost identical to the Stoic idea of withholding assent. Temptation was not sin, agreement was. Christian asceticism adopted Stoic emotional discipline while redirecting its goal. Where Stoics sought alignment with reason and nature, monks sought alignment with God. But the methods overlapped. Attention to thought, control of desire, acceptance of hardship, and focus on inner stability. Stoic language also shaped Christian moral teaching. The emphasis on patience, endurance, humility, and self-control echoed Stoic virtues almost directly. Even the concept of indifference to external status found a new form in Christian rejection of worldly honour. Wealth, reputation, and power were treated as distractions rather than achievements. Importantly, Christianity softened Stoicism's severity. Where Stoics often aimed at emotional invulnerability, Christian thinkers allowed grief, compassion, and vulnerability, but still warned against being ruled by them. The goal shifted from self-sufficiency to inner obedience, but discipline remained central. This fusion preserved Stoicism through a cultural transition that erased many pagan schools entirely. While temples closed and philosophical lineages broke, Stoic practices survived inside monasteries, sermons, and moral instruction. The name faded, the method endured. Mental clarity through restraint, acceptance of suffering, and mastery of judgment became Christian virtues, even when their philosophical origins were forgotten. Stoicism did not convert. It was absorbed. By the time medieval Europe emerged, few remembered Zeno or the Stoa. But the Stoic mind was still at work, watching thoughts, resisting impulse, and seeking calm in a difficult world. Stoicism did not need to survive as a label. Its strength was practical enough to live on without one. Stoicism returned not through temples or schools, but through psychology. Long before it became fashionable again, its core insights quietly reappeared in modern approaches to mental health. The idea that suffering is shaped less by events and more by interpretation resurfaced in therapeutic language, stripped of ancient metaphysics, but intact in function. Modern cognitive approaches echo a Stoic claim that once seemed radical. Thoughts are not facts. Emotional distress follows judgment, not circumstance. By identifying distorted thinking and correcting it, clarity can be restored. This is Stoicism translated into clinical practice. The techniques changed names. The mechanism remained the same. Stoicism also found renewed relevance in the aftermath of mass trauma. War, displacement, and totalitarian violence forced modern thinkers to ask the same question Zeno once asked: what remains when everything external is taken? One of the most powerful modern voices to answer that question was Viktor Frankl. Having survived the concentration camps, Frankl argued that meaning, not comfort, was the foundation of psychological survival. His conclusions mirror Stoic thought almost exactly. Freedom, he claimed, exists in the space between stimulus and response. In popular culture, Stoicism resurfaced as a counterweight to constant stimulation and emotional excess. In an age of outrage, comparison, and anxiety, its insistence on restraint and internal control felt almost subversive. Stoicism did not promise happiness. It promised resilience. That distinction mattered. Modern self-help often borrows Stoic ideas while removing their ethical core. Techniques are adopted for productivity, confidence, or stress reduction. But classical Stoicism was never about optimization alone. It tied mental clarity to virtue, honesty, fairness, courage, and responsibility. Clarity without ethics was considered dangerous. This tension defines Stoicism's modern revival. It is admired for its calm, but often misunderstood as emotional suppression. In reality, Stoicism demands emotional awareness, not denial. It asks for engagement with reality as it is, without illusion or dramatization. What makes Stoicism endure is not nostalgia for antiquity. It is relevance. The world remains unstable. Loss remains inevitable. Attention remains fragmented. Stoicism offers a way to stand upright within that instability, without pretending it will disappear. Its appeal today reflects the same need it addressed in ancient Greece and imperial Rome: how to live well when certainty is impossible. Different centuries, same question. Stoicism keeps answering, quietly, persistently, and without promise of comfort. Stoicism endures because it never promised escape. It promised clarity. In every era where it resurfaced, the same conditions were present: uncertainty, loss, noise, and pressure. Stoicism does not try to eliminate these forces. It teaches how to meet them without breaking. At its core, Stoicism offers a redefinition of strength. Strength is not dominance, emotional intensity, or constant confidence. It is the ability to remain steady when conditions deteriorate. It is the refusal to let fear, anger, or desire dictate action. This kind of strength is quiet. It does not announce itself, but it lasts. Mental clarity, in the Stoic sense, is not a permanent state of calm. It is a practice of alignment. Alignment between judgment and reality, between values and behavior, between what one wants and what one accepts. When these are in conflict, the mind fractures. When they are aligned, resilience emerges. Stoicism also places responsibility back where it belongs. Not on fate, not on others, not on circumstances, but on judgment. This is demanding. It removes the comfort of blame. But it also restores agency. If distress arises from interpretation, then clarity is achievable through discipline. The world may remain harsh, but the inner response can improve. This is why Stoicism resists simplification. It is not positive thinking. It does not encourage optimism for its own sake. It asks for realism, paired with restraint. It acknowledges pain without amplifying it. It allows grief without surrendering reason. It accepts impermanence without despair. In a culture that often equates emotional expression with authenticity, Stoicism can appear cold. But its aim is not emotional erasure. It is emotional proportion. To feel what is appropriate, for as long as it is useful, without letting feeling become identity. What Stoicism ultimately offers is not happiness, but reliability. A Stoic person becomes someone others can depend on in crisis, not because they feel nothing, but because they are not overwhelmed. This is why the philosophy appealed to rulers, slaves, monks, soldiers, and survivors alike. Different lives, same need. Stoicism does not promise that life will be fair. It promises that clarity is possible anyway. That is its quiet power. 2,000 years after its birth beneath a painted porch, Stoicism remains what it always was. A philosophy for people who cannot afford illusion, but still want to live well.